My name is Aaron Hager. I'm the Extension Weed Scientist in the Department of Crop Sciences at the University of Illinois. And the topic of conversation for today is weed control in silage corn. What we hope to accomplish through today's learning objectives would be to, number one, recognize why weed control is so important in the production of silage corn. Number two, we will identify some of the key factors that go into selecting a herbicide program for use in silage corn production. And then finally, visit the topic about how to determine the best time to apply a particular herbicide. So the first question that we'll ask is, why do we actually control weeds in silage corn? There are many reasons why we do this, one of which, of course, is to preserve the quality and digestibility of the silage itself. Weeds growing with corn can actually reduce the nitrogen content of corn, which would ultimately affect the quality of the silage corn that's being used. A second reason would be to eliminate weed seed production and dispersal. We have many different types of weeds that can grow with corn, and any time that these weeds are allowed to exist long enough to make viable seed, we always then have that potential that these weed seeds would be dispersed through the silage corn process. A third reason would be that some weeds can actually produce toxic compounds during the ensiling process. Either the weed itself or, in some instances, the weed seeds are known to produce these toxic compounds that can be injurious to livestock. And then finally, and perhaps one of the most important reasons to control weeds in silage corn, a very similar reason that we control weeds in virtually all of our crops, is to preserve the yield potential of the crop itself. When we talk about preserving yield potential, one easy way to try to think about the concept of this is that every acre of land that we farm, that we grow corn on, has only a finite amount of resources available to support plant growth. These plants that we consider weeds really have the same requirements for all these resources that the corn crop has, whether it be water, nutrients, space, or whatever. And we simply control weeds so that more of these resources are available to the crop and not lost to the weed itself. This reduces the competition for these resources, making them more available to the crop to produce or express its maximum genetic yield potential. Now, besides competition, there's also other ways that weeds can reduce crop yield. And a very good example of a weed that can actually reduce crop yield, not necessarily through competition for resources, but rather through a harvest difficulty or harvest challenges, is a species called burr cucumber. And as you can see in this slide, burr cucumber is a very vining type of species. It grows all over the corn crop itself and makes harvesting efficiency very, very difficult for the farmers. The weeds that farmers contend with have demonstrated one of three different life cycles. They could be an annual, a biennial, or a perennial. It's very important to know the life cycle of these species because it can influence how we best manage these species, especially if a herbicide would be part of our weed management program. Annuals are those species that complete their life cycle, and by their life cycle we mean from seed to seed within one growing season. Biennials take 2 years to complete their life cycle, whereas perennials, depending on the species, generally grow multiple years, in theory indefinitely. If we look at the control of annual weed species with herbicides, this graph simply illustrates a relative comparison of the various growth stages when the herbicide was applied and how effective the herbicide treatment was at controlling the annual weeds. Generally speaking, the smaller the weed, the earlier in the life cycle that a herbicide is applied, the greater the level of control that we will achieve. And as the plants go from the seedling stage to the vegetative stage, to the flowering stage, and certainly finally at plant maturity, the level of control consistently goes down. This is a little bit different if we have to contend with some of the perennial weed species. Here again, one similarity between perennials and annuals is that the seedling stage is the most vulnerable stage for a herbicide to work effectively. As the perennial species assume a perennial growth habit going from the seedling stage to the vegetative stage, the level of control with a herbicide can drop off very, very quickly. We can get a little bit better control if we can target the application then right before the perennial species begin the flowering process at what's called the bud stage. And we also can get a little bit improved control if we wait until the fall of the year to apply a translocated herbicide that would move down to the root system of the perennial species. Just a little bit of conversation about weed seeds themselves. A very good weed management program in silage corn also reduces the likelihood of weed seed movement either across the field itself or even among fields. Now, even though we do harvest silage corn typically sooner than we do field corn, there are some weed species that can produce viable seed by the time that the silage is harvested. The ensiling process often reduces the viability of any weed seed, but the reduction in the viability depends on numerous factors. Number one, of course, would be the weed species. Typically, ensiling has been shown to reduce the viability of grass weed species to a greater extent than broadleaf weed species. There are some broadleaf weed species that tend to have a hard seed coat, and these tend to survive the ensiling process better, more efficiently than those that don't have such a hard seed coat. It would also depend on the duration of the ensiling, the temperature that's reached during the ensiling process, etc. Now, sometimes viable weed seed that is fed to livestock can also remain viable through the digestive tract of the animal. And these seeds then are deposited in the manure, and if the manure is spread across the field where this species has not been known to exist before, this can be a way that we actually introduce weeds into fields previously non-infested. One example of seed movement through animals that's been shown in increasing areas across much of the Midwest is a species called palmeri amaranth. This is a species that is historically native to the Sonoran Desert area of the southwestern United States, but shows up more frequently now in many areas of the Midwest. One way is that the palmeri amaranth has moved from its area of historic distribution now to the Midwest is by movement of the seed. And it has been shown that palmeri amaranth seed can be a contaminant of certain livestock feeds. For example, it has been shown to be able to move in cotton feeds from areas in the south that is produced. And then as these seeds are fed through the animal, they pass through the digestive tract of the cow and then ultimately are spread into the field with the manure. So thinking about the concept of weed control in field corn and silage corn. In general, the methods of weed control are going to be very similar between field corn and silage corn. Some of the main areas that we use or techniques that we use to control weeds would fall into one of these three categories. Cultural practices are those that the farmer is able to manage or control, for example. Anything from planting day to adequate soil fertility to the hybrid selection to the seeding rate are any of those factors that would allow the crop to become very quickly established in the field. Tillage is also a very effective weed control tool. We can do tillage before we plant, or we can actually do tillage between the rows once the corn has emerged. And then finally, herbicides are very, very important parts of our weed control program in both field and silage corn. We generally characterize herbicides as those that are primarily soil applied. These can be applied either before planting. These can be mechanically incorporated or pre-plant incorporated into the soil, or applied after planting, perhaps before the weeds emerge in a pre-emergence setting. And then foliar applied, and those would simply be herbicides that are applied after the crop and after the weeds have emerged. Soil-applied herbicides are a very important component of weed management in both field corn and silage corn because when they work effectively, they allow the corn crop to become established with a minimal amount of weed interference. So really, we don't allow the weeds to begin to compete for those resources that the corn needs in order to establish and maximize its genetic yield potential. We also have very many good post herbicides. Now, these are often not necessarily used by themselves, but rather they're often used in a planned two-pass program, using a soil-applied herbicide first and then using the post herbicide to clean up any weed escapes that may ultimately come through. Now, one thing, of course, to keep in mind with a post-applied herbicide, the application timing is very, very important in order for good weed control and to avoid the risk of crop injury. Each herbicide that's labeled for use has to have a federal Section 3 label. It's a very, very good document to read. Each herbicide has these labels, and it contains much of the information that the end user would need in order to effectively use the product. Now, it's always very good and advisable to check the respective herbicide label for certain pieces of information. Number one, of course, what is the type of corn the herbicide can be used in? For example, most corn herbicides that are labeled for field corn can also be used in seed corn and silage corn, but not all herbicides that are labeled for use in field corn could be applied to things like either sweet corn or popcorn. We also need to check the label to determine if there's a time required or specified on the label between when it's applied and when the corn crop can be harvested. Now, these intervals can sometimes vary between whether or not the seed is harvested and taken to the elevator as grain, or if it be harvested for silage corn. And then finally, of course, always check the label for any specific warnings related to dairy cattle. For example, there could be a herbicide label that advises that the treated corn is not grazed or harvested within a certain number of days after the application, for example, or that the application should not be made after some certain developmental stage of the corn crop itself. Now, some of the factors that actually impact herbicide performance. If we think again about the soil-applied herbicides, the activity of many of these products is governed primarily by edaphic factors, those factors that are associated with the soil itself. For example, the soil texture. What is the relative amount of the sand, silt, and clay particles for a given field? Typically, soils that tend to be higher in clays tend to require a higher rate of herbicide compared with very coarse or sandy textured soils. The organic matter content of the soil is very important to determine herbicide rate. Typically, the higher the organic matter, the more adsorption of the herbicide that can take place in the soil. And all products, regardless of what they are, regardless of the active ingredient or who manufactures the compound, all soil-applied herbicides need to be in the soil solution in order to be available for plant uptake. Now, if we think about weed control with foliar-applied herbicides, many times the factors associated with the environment are very, very important. The environment when the herbicide is applied, and even the environment that was encountered by the weed population for several days before and after the application. For example, things like relative humidity. Temperature, very important in terms of influencing the impact of foliar-applied herbicides. Typically, a good rule of thumb is that the best weed control with foliar-applied herbicide is realized when the applications are made to small weeds. Now, small, of course, is a relative term, but generally weeds that are somewhere in the range of perhaps 2 to 4 inches in size. When you select a herbicide for use in silage corn, one of the very important criteria, of course, is to ensure that that herbicide is labeled for that appropriate use. Check the herbicide label just to make sure that it's approved for silage corn, or if there are any specific time intervals or any other prohibitions on the label that would restrict its use for weed control in silage corn. And of course, select a herbicide program that will control the target weed spectrum. Now, the weed spectrum often varies from field to field, and it can even vary across from one side of the field to the next. You really don't know what the spectrum would be any given year without the process of scouting the fields and keeping very good records on each individual field. For the timing of the herbicide applications, a general rule of thumb with soil-applied herbicides, the closer they're applied to when the corn is planted, the longer you're going to realize weed control throughout the growing season. Many of the products are actually labeled for applications that could take place 30, perhaps even as soon as 45 days before planting, but generally somewhere in the range of up to about 21 days before planting to just about the time before the corn emerges is a very good window to try to make the application. For foliar-applied herbicides, again, the applications made to small weeds tend to provide better control than applications that are made to larger weeds. And certainly consult the label to make sure that we know what the interval is in terms of the corn development stage. Most labels will specify that the application should be made before the corn either reaches a certain height or a certain number of leaves or leaf collars. And once again, make sure we pay attention to all the intervals that are specified between when the application is made and when the corn could be harvested for silage. And really, to maximize silage yield, an integrated weed control program often gives better yield potential than any one single tactic by itself. Now, remember we talked a little bit about the post-applied herbicides. We have some very good post-applied herbicides that can be used in silage corn, but rarely do we see post-only type programs. These are very risky for corn in terms of being able to have the application made before the competition for resources between the corn and the weeds actually reduce the yield potential of the corn. So something like a soil-applied program, followed by a post-applied program, integrating tillage and good cultural practices, is a system that really allows the corn to express its maximum genetic potential better than any one single tactic by itself. It's always good to try to remove weed interference or weed competition within a period of about 2 to 3 weeks after the corn crop has emerged. And we can certainly remove this interference with herbicides, with tillage, mechanical methods, or even by hand if necessary. And then continue to scout the corn crop throughout the growing season. And if weed emergence continues following the first post-application, we may need to make a second follow-up application for control of later emerging weeds, not so much perhaps to reduce the interference potential, but again, recognizing the need that certain weed species can make viable seed by the time that the corn crop is harvested for silage. So the take-home messages from today's lesson. Number one, of course, is effective weed control helps ensure that we maximize the yield of the corn for silage and for grain, and also helps reduce the weed seed production that can lead to future weed problems in years ahead. Now, herbicides can be a very good component of an integrated weed control program for silage corn, but before we use any product, any herbicide in the marketplace, be sure that we read and follow all label directions. So we'd like to thank everybody for taking the time to go through these learning objectives with us, and we hope you all have a good day.